Good morning. We are presenting on climate change adaptation through agricultural strategies. And next slide. So the issue we are focusing on is an increase in population will reduce the food supply. The agricultural industry will have trouble keeping up with the demand, especially with more severe drought conditions. However, the agricultural industry can adapt their practices to conserve water and maintain a healthy landscape for future food production. We are looking at the Colorado River Basin for a general overview on water supply and irrigation. Irrigation has been a key role in mass food production. To get an even closer look at this issue, Tyler and Ross will talk about what is being done on the ground in Salida and Palisade. Diego and Amber will highlight future solutions. Next slide. So this is the Colorado River Basin. As you can see, it's pretty extensive. It supplies water to 7 U.S. states and 2 states in Mexico. Supplies water to 36 million people. About 70% of the water supply used for irrigation is from the Colorado River Basin, and it provides 80% of our winter produce. And if we zone in just to Colorado, on the western slope, it's 918,000 acres are irrigated. On the eastern slope, 2,548,000 acres are irrigated. According to Colorado's recent water planning report, acreage could reduce by as much as 161,000 by 2050 due to urbanization and planned agriculture to urban water transfers. How we use this water in Colorado affects our neighboring states within the Colorado River Basin. So adaptation is key in reducing water usage. So Tyler will discuss some local adaptation.
So one of the advantages of our group was we're each in a different region. So I focused on the Arkansas Valley stakeholders and conducted interviews there with an NRCS district conservationist, the land trustee of Arkansas, and local farmers. The main source of agriculture in the Arkansas Valley is cattle and cattle grazing, livestock, and also hay to feed livestock. And then there are some small vegetable producers as well. So talking to Bill Gardner, the NRCS district conservationist, he talked a lot about conserving natural water sources that are already existing. So one of the ways to do that is spring development. And the way to go about that is if there's a small spring, instead of allowing it to run off into a stream or onto the landscape, they dig ditches to either pipe into that spring and then store it in a stock tank. Or another method would be just to build a reservoir right where the spring comes out to utilize that extra water source. And the key here is just making the water spread further over the grazing land. That's why I asked about the one rock dams to see if that might be an application for something like this. Another thing that he talked about was reducing loss. And a big way to do that was through gated pipe irrigation because there's it's more efficient because it's going straight into the ground. Another way is replacing ditches with pipeline because those ditches have a lot of seepage, they're older, and a lot of them have been there since the late 1800s. So replacing those with pipes can save a lot of water. And then also planting drought-resistant crops. So alfalfa uses 2 acre-feet, and many alternatives could provide the same amount of feed on 15 inches of water a year of precipitation, so that's not even full irrigation. And there are a few examples here of drought-resistant crops. That's a picture of meadow brome. There's also needlegrass, vegetables. I think there's one more that doesn't show up. And different varieties of wheatgrass. So another adaptation strategy that the NRCS talked about was reducing input costs as production declines because of drought. And one way to do that is replacing hay, because hay is very labor intensive and mechanically intensive, and also controlled grazing. So you can see the electrical fence on that. So you can allow one area of the field to grow while grazing takes place on another, and then transfer the cattle over. And one farmer that I talked to is actually switching from hay to produce. Traditionally in the Arkansas Valley, they've grown potatoes and lettuce, so that's what she's going to try to grow to offset, because 3 years ago, the last major drought year, her water was shut off in July, and so that same thing is probably going to happen this year. And so she's going to water her hay fields until then, and then use the well water to irrigate lettuce and potatoes. And then another stakeholder I talked to was Andrew Mackey of the Land Trust of the Upper Arkansas. And he had a great quote that I thought I would share, just about that people probably aren't going to stop eating beef, unfortunately. As much as we like to hope that that's going to happen, that's not the reality. And so finding ways to raise them locally rather than shipping them from somewhere else. So one of the methods that they're using for that is broadening the definition of agriculture, and that way in the future, when some of the scenarios, if they take place, when they take place, they'll be able to do more with grazing. And also another big important role that the Land Trust does is monitoring lands. So there's definitely possible application for some of the techniques the NRCS talked about. And then also using easements as adaptation, because placing an easement on property would be a means of income to supplement costs in drought years. And grazing is still allowed on easement properties. And one more thing I was going to share from another farmer that I talked to locally was that they're on a senior water right, and they're producing vegetables. So they really don't have an adaptation strategy, which I thought was really interesting. They're well aware of the predictions and projections, but they kind of said, well, if they run out of water, then there's going to be bigger problems, because there's going to be a lot less water downstream than for municipalities. Anyone else?
So in Palisade, where I live, which is a pretty traditional historical agricultural valley, the main crops are tree fruit and vines. And the main preferred technique probably still is furrow irrigation, where basically water runs right along the edges of the trees. These furrows are dug constantly throughout the growing season. They fill with weeds, and because of that technique, there's a lot of runoff, a lot of salts, a lot of fertilizers and pesticides entering the waterways. And then we'll try to make a switch over to this micro drip. NRCS is willing to provide about 75% of the cost share program to help farmers make this transition to a more sustainable usage of water. And basically, these are some of the technologies that are available. I think there's a misconception of a farmer on a tractor with a pitchfork, and that still holds true in Palisade in a lot of cases, but there's also this kind of emerging technology where this stuff is remotely controlled through tablets, weather stations, soil precipitation levels, humidity, all these things that can be controlled from afar. And I think Amber will get into it later, but I think this could be hugely instrumental in saving millions of gallons. Let me see. Okay, this is our current infrastructure in Palisade. So this is the ditch that runs through my property. It's kind of in the middle of this trash heap. And I think that kind of represents a lot of the attitudes people still have as far as taking it for granted, the amount of water that we have. That's a cement cistern that leaks everywhere. The pipes popped up by wood. It leaks constantly. It's like, I can't believe this is a legitimate operation here. So here's a little interview. Let's see if this thing plays. This is an interview I did with the head of the Palisade Agricultural Irrigation District.
Our top 3 offenders 4 years ago, we're probably talking in the ballpark of 19 to 20 million gallons worth of irrigation water over the course of a year. So hugely inefficient. Most of that has to do with, I'd say how the system's operated and people who aren't really irrigators. So I think you could throw urban sprawl into the mix.
Wow.
Most farmers are, we'll say you have a 40-acre farm, they're pretty efficient about how they irrigate because they'll lose their crops, they'll lose their topsoil, they'll lose their fertilizer. There's tons of things that'll go wrong if they don't do a reasonably efficient job. Turn that 40 acres into, let's say, 130 houses, and you still have the open ditch system. The water's generally going to run through there 24/7, whether anybody's watering or not, because people like to have it available whenever it's convenient for them to walk out of their house and turn their pump on.
Right. And you think there's, so basic, are there issues of like infrastructure? I mean, obviously the switch to an open ditch to pipe was an infrastructure advancement.
Infrastructure element, and there's also
A user element.
for a user element, because there are systems where it's open ditches, and because we got together with them and they cooperate and they say, hey, you know what we're going to basically do is instead of having this thing on 24/7, we're going to switch to a watering schedule where we're going to have water available between, say, 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening on these 3 days of a week, and we'll concentrate all of our use into some narrower window. And that fits the agricultural model much better, and it's much more around the design of the way our canal operates than just let the thing bleed all day and night, whether you're using water or not.
Right. Interesting.
So looking at other stuff, and you're talking about going from surface irrigation to drip or micro sprinklers. I think for on-farm stuff and based on feedback we've heard from people is where you have a much better control over how you apply the water, how much water you apply, things like fertigation, where they can inject
Fertilizer into the line, yeah.
and all that. That they get way better yields, and better yields over the course of the lifespan of the system will tend to pay for the system and still lead you to a more profitable farm, so to speak.
So yeah, that's just basically a local water manager kind of extolling the virtues of transitioning over to this system. Yeah, go to the next slide. Sorry. And then this gentleman right here is from the CSU Extension Agency, and he paid my property to visit it and handles their small acreage program. And basically, he provides these services to people that ask for them free of charge. He's developing a cover crop program that allows deeper penetration of the water into the soil, better retention, and he's stressing the importance of soil health. And I think that's crucial when you're looking at water system as a whole. It's not an isolated issue, and it's tied to kind of a lot of environmental factors as well.
All right, so hi everybody. I'm going to talk about kind of future to-dos and maybe ways we can improve our irrigation strategies and ways to improve also our agricultural landscape. So one of those is through obviously funding and partnerships. Funding streams such as the NRCS. I don't know if you guys are aware, but the NRCS actually has a program where they help fund center pivot projects. So for ranchers and farmers, if they are willing to stop their row irrigation and put in a center pivot, the NRCS will actually help fund that project. The purpose of them doing that is it helps people irrigate more efficiently. It causes less damage to the ground. You don't have the constant rows running through your crop. It also decreases the amount of water seepage into the ground, therefore there's less water wasted. There's less evaporation, and it decreases the cost in diesel and decreases the emissions that are set out. Next slide, please. Okay, so Ross mentioned this a little bit, cover crops. It's a really good way
to decrease the amount of irrigation that's needed, as well as improve soil health. So it's a working solution because it does decrease soil temperature, it improves soil health, it retains soil moisture, which therefore leads to less irrigation needs. And as you all know, bare ground equals crusty soil on top, and that crusty soil makes it hard for water to penetrate. So cover crops help water seepage into those crops. And so also with cover crops, you can have them either as a secondary crop that you harvest. You can use them for animal consumption, so you can harvest the taller grains, and then once you're done harvesting, you can have cattle come in and actually feed. It's a good source to feed for cattle or sheep or goats or horses. A lot of ranchers are actually, because soil health has become such an integral part of agriculture, they're actually leaving the cover crops as leafy matter to help improve soil conditions. Cover crops are amazing. They're a really good solution because you can use multiple types of crops. For example, there are some crops that fix atmospheric nitrogen, and there's some that use it. So hairy vetch fixes nitrogen, and then the annual rye will actually use leftover nitrogen. So a lot of times those two crops are planted together to help fix that soil nutrient issue. Next slide, please. All right, so riparian area watershed. I know we're focusing on agricultural land, but riparian areas play a big part in that. If we can increase the water retention within the watershed, more of that water is going to make it down to our agricultural lands. And on top of that, it also leaves, if we can improve our riparian areas, it creates more forage for wildlife, which decreases the amount of forage that wildlife take on agricultural lands. A good example of this in the Gunnison Basin, as most of you are well aware of, is the One Rock Dams with Bill's e-bike. Another example is the Gunnison Basin Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment for the Gunnison Climate Working Group. This was a paper that was produced, or a report produced, that kind of talked about both agricultural land and riparian areas, and basically at a watershed level. One thing they stated in there was mid-elevation riparian ecosystems and irrigated hay meadows are vulnerable to climate changes in timing of snowmelt, increased invasive species, decreased base flows, and drought. And for a copy of that report, we'll post those after the presentation. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to rush through this a little bit because we're down to about 2 minutes left. Ross already hit on the Rainbird technology, the climate minder system that they have in place that seems to be working really good. We need more advances like that. The Water Action Up is a website that most of the projects on that website are in more arid climates. However, the processes that they're using to save water and improve their irrigation techniques could easily be used in the Gunnison Valley or in the region there. There was a study done by McDonald in Gerbet in 2013, and that study is posted on the Nature Conservancy website. And there's 2 quotes I pulled from that report that I wanted to share with you guys. The first one says that by avoiding the release of 1 gigaton of carbon, the U.S. alone could save roughly 17 billion gallons in irrigation water annually. So that's something to think about. The second quote that I pulled from it is, a historic trend toward greater irrigation efficiency, a trend that, if continued, could offset most of the predicted future demands on irrigation. So basically that's saying if we can continue the technology and science for irrigation that we have the ability to offset that those impacts from climate change. And I also have a copy of that website and that report if anybody needs it. I think that's it.
To to go further into the technology that we're really preaching on here, thought we'd throw up some numbers to really show the effects that these new technologies can attribute as far as water savings. Using this rainbird that Ross touched on, Amber touched on, these are the typical, these were just some figures that were on the website as far as typical irrigation times during 4 days a week, 10 minutes a day. The amount of water used is significantly decreased, and so I think we keep hitting on this particular technology in large part because we can see that it's effective, and also as Amber stated through the NRCS program, there is funding available for switching all irrigations on agricultural plots over to these kinds of things. I think as a conclusion and overall view of this, and looking into the future, the agricultural industry in general is huge, right? It produces 105,000 jobs here in Colorado alone, $7 billion annually in Colorado, and $200 billion annually across the United States. So it's clearly a huge sector of our economy and our society. Now, with help from federal agencies such as the NRCS and the U.S. Department of Interior, the U.S. Department of Interior Reclamation, there are policies in place to help promote some of these things. The Department of Interior, with the help of Colorado's Ken Salazar, did push forward the Water Smart program back in 2010, a program that has been highly effective in really pushing forth interactions between landowners, communities, and implementing some better ways to utilize the water systems to irrigation. So the policy, the red tape around it, as we all know as well, right now the Colorado Water Plan is a big player here in the States. There's public feedback that's open right now. Those kinds of techniques and feedback mechanisms can play a huge help here. Touching on the three main points that the rest of the group covered, better technology to cover crops and grazing techniques can also be attributed to, or can be hugely influential as adaptation techniques. So yeah, that's, so if you have any questions. Thanks for the patience on the shifting there. Not accounted for.
Yeah, I got a question. So like increasing water efficiency means basically increasing consumptive use of water. So do you see that there's going to be further negative ecological impacts of water efficient systems? And how would you address that? Or?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So, is there going to be further negative ecological impacts of switching to more efficient agricultural irrigation?
Through increased production?
Well, so by irrigating efficiently, you're using more of the water you put on the fields, which means increasing consumption of the consumptive use of that water, which would then allow water right holder intending to use their water right to either increase the amount of land they have in production or switch to more higher value water intensive crops, which would further exacerbate ecological, I don't know.
Yeah, it's the juxtaposition, right? Kind of driving the hybrid more miles. Do you guys want to take that one?
I don't see any potential major ecological challenges. Then perhaps the one you brought up as far as farmers expanding cultivation, that would be one that could be a legitimate claim. But in general, I think it's almost 95% positive as far as you're using way less water. I mean, you're talking about a fraction of the percentages being used now to accomplish the same function.
And I'll touch on that a little bit too in the research that I was looking at. With the more efficient irrigation techniques, you are actually going to produce denser crops as well as crops with higher nutritional value. And so I'm kind of like Ross, I don't foresee people wanting to expand their area because they're actually going to be producing more crops, I guess, I don't know the word I'm looking for, with the same amount of water.
Yeah, one more and then we should move on.
How do you see water efficiency and switching to more efficient technologies kind of interacting with like the cultural value of like a traditional pastoral livelihood where, you know, like it might just be difficult to switch over because of those values that are ingrained in like a 5th or 6th generation rancher that's been ranching the same lands for several decades.
I mean, saliva would probably be more that, but I would say like as far as just transitioning to a more drought tolerant forage is something that doesn't necessarily compromise a lot of the cultural values. And it's something that could be done as sort of a small step. Maybe putting in pumps and changing irrigation pivots would be something that would take a little more flexibility on behalf of the ranchers, but it's something that eventually we're going to have to come to terms with.
And I think affecting the bottom line is really the most important thing. I don't know the correct solution for that, but I think that's the only way to change a lot of people's minds. I actually did try to contact a few people there might be potential climate deniers to try to get their perspective, and didn't have my emails for phone calls return, mostly from the Upper Arkansas Water Conservancy District and another cattle ranch. And I think they don't want to talk about it. I mean, I'm sure also like talking to Steve is going to factor in the day-to-day, but a lot of it is just they'd rather not deal with it.
Thank you, guys.